Sophie Miller had never been one for luxury. At 38, she lived in a modest brownstone in Boston's Back Bay, drove a 10-year-old Volvo, and preferred coffee shops to upscale restaurants. Her wardrobe consisted of practical basics, simple dresses, comfortable shoes, and cardigans that had seen better days. Few people knew that this unassuming woman had built Next Health Solutions from nothing into $1 billion company revolutionizing patient care systems across America. Sophie preferred to remain behind the scenes, letting her business partner Leo handle public relations and media appearances. "You're the brains, I'm the face," Leo often joked. And Sophie was perfectly content with this arrangement, on a quiet. Tuesday afternoon, Sophie sat cross-legged on her office floor, surrounded by paperwork. Her company had just finalized another successful quarter, and she was reviewing potential charitable causes to support. "Cancer research, education initiatives, homeless shelters," she murmured, sifting through folders. Her assistant Naomi watched. From the doorway, most CEOs have their philanthropy departments handle this, she remarked, setting down a cup of tea beside her boss. Sophie smiled without looking up. Most CEOs don't care where their tax write-offs go. The truth was, philanthropy wasn't just a corporate obligation for Sophie. It was deeply personal. 20 years ago, her younger brother Owen had lost his battle with leukemia. She'd watched helplessly as medical bills bankrupted her parents, who had worked honest jobs their entire lives. That experience had fueled both her business vision and her commitment to giving back. "There's a difference between signing checks and making change," Sophie often said. She donated millions over the years, always anonymously. The money went directly to causes she thoroughly researched, with minimal fanfare and no buildings named in her honor. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mason Reed, a former programmer, who had worked for her company before moving to a position at the Children's Cancer Research Foundation. "Just checking if you're coming tomorrow night. The Reed Child Cancer Gala is the event of the season, and we're hoping to raise enough for the new research wing." Sophie hesitated. She avoided society events like the plague, too much small talk, too many judgmental glances at her simple attire and unpolished manners. But Mason had been an exceptional employee, and more importantly, the cause resonated deeply with her. "I'll be there," she texted back, already feeling a knot form in her stomach. "You're actually going?" Naomi's eyes widened the next morning. "You hate these society functions." Sophie continued typing on her laptop without looking up. "The Reed Gala supports pediatric cancer research." Owen would have been 32 this year. Her voice softened at the mention of her brother. Naomi nodded, understanding immediately. "What will you wear?" This made Sophie pause. Her wardrobe wasn't exactly filled with gala-appropriate attire. "I have that cream dress from Leo's wedding. That was 3 years ago, and I've worn it exactly once." "It's perfectly good," Sophie countered when Naomi sighed. Later that afternoon, Mason called, his voice bubbling with excitement. "Sophie, I can't believe you're actually coming. I've put you at table 16. Not at the front, I hope," Sophie said immediately. Mason laughed. No, I know better than that. It's toward the back, but still a good table. The Hollands will be there. They run that investment firm downtown. And the Clarksons, they're major donors." "Sounds fine," Sophie replied, though the thought of making small talk with Boston's elite made her stomach clench. "Just don't introduce me as the CEO of Next Health." "Never. As far as anyone knows, you're just an old friend who works in tech." "Promise?" At 7 the next evening, Sophie stood before her bathroom mirror. The cream-colored dress was simple but elegant, with a modest neckline and buttons down the front. Her blonde hair fell in natural waves to her shoulders. The only makeup she wore was a touch of mascara and lipstick. No jewelry except her mother's small pearl earrings. No designer handbag, just a plain clutch. She looked nice. Presentable, certainly not like someone who could write a check for millions without blinking. An eyed-out as the sleek black sedan pulled away from her brownstone, Sophie felt oddly vulnerable. In her everyday life, she moved through the world unrecognized, unnoticed. Her wealth was abstract numbers on a statement, not something visible on her person. Tonight, she would be stepping into a world where worth was measured by appearance. A world where her simple dress and unadorned wrists would immediately mark her as an outsider. The Four Seasons Hotel ballroom had been transformed into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with elaborate floral arrangements. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music nearly drowned out by the buzz of conversation and the gentle clink of champagne glasses. Sophie stood at the entrance, invitation clutched tightly in hand. Already she felt out of place. Women draped in designer gowns and sparkling jewels air-kissed each other, while men in perfectly tailored tuxedos discussed stock portfolios and summer homes. Name, please? The hostess at the check-in table wore a practiced smile. Sophie Miller. The woman scanned her list, her perfectly manicured nail moving down the page. Miller. Miller dot dot dot. Ah, yes. Table 16. Her smile faltered slightly as she took in Sophie's simple appearance. In the back, she added unnecessarily. Sophie thanked her and moved into the crowd. Keenly aware of the sidelong glances, she could almost hear the unspoken questions. Who is she? Why is she dressed like that? Doesn't she know this is a black tie? Event? Sophie. Mason's familiar voice cut through her discomfort. He peered beside her, looking handsome in his tuxedo. You made it? I said I would, she replied, genuinely happy to see her former employee. As they weaved through tables, Sophie noticed a shift in atmosphere. Near the entrance, where the most expensive tables were located, guests exuded old money and influence. The further back they walked, the less rarefied the air became. 16 was positioned near the back of the ballroom as promised. Already seated were 3 couples, all impeccably dressed and deep in conversation. They looked up as Mason approached. Everyone, this is my friend Sophie Miller, Mason announced. Sophie, meet the Hollands, the Clarksons, and the Franklins. A chorus of polite hellos followed, though Sophie didn't miss the quick once-overs. The raised eyebrows, the exchange of glances. She'd seen it all before, the instant assessment and dismissal. Sophie works in technology, Mason added before being called away by another guest. How interesting, said Mrs. Holland, a slim woman with silver hair twisted into an elaborate updo. What exactly do you do? Software development, Sophie replied simply, taking her seat. My nephew is into computers, Mr. Clarkson commented. As if technology were a childish hobby rather than a global industry, conversation resumed around her, with Sophie occasionally nodding or offering brief responses when directly addressed. She was used to this being overlooked, underestimated. Usually it didn't bother her. Tonight, though, surrounded by people who measured worth by appearances, it stung more than she cared to admit. Excuse me, a voice interrupted her thoughts. A server stood beside her, looking uncomfortable. I'm sorry, but I've been asked to verify. Are you sure you're at the correct table? The question hung in the air. Across the table, Mrs. Holland smirked behind her champagne glass. I assure you I'm at the correct table, Sophie replied evenly, though heat crept up her neck. Table 16. The server shifted uncomfortably. It's just that this section is reserved for certain donors, and I have an invitation, Sophie finished firmly, producing the embossed card from her clutch. The server examined it, then nodded stiffly. My apologies, Miss Miller. He retreated, but the damage was done. A heavy silence fell over table 16, broken only when Victoria Holland leaned toward her husband. Really, the standards have slipped this year. I remember when the Reed Gala was exclusive. The comment wasn't meant to be overheard, but it carried just enough for Sophie to catch. The Clarksons exchanged meaningful glances, while Mrs. Franklin suddenly became very interested in her napkin. Sophie took a slow sip of water, her face carefully neutral. She was no stranger to dismissal. She'd faced it throughout her career, especially in the early days when she was a female programmer in a male-dominated field. But there was something particularly cutting about being judged solely on appearance by people who knew nothing about her. The awkwardness was mercifully interrupted by the dinner. as plates of seared scallops were placed before each guest. Conversation resumed, though Sophie noticed she was now being actively excluded. Margaret's daughter just got accepted to Harvard, Mrs. Clarkson announced. Legacy, of course. Of course, Mrs. Holland nodded approvingly. Where did you attend, miss? She turned to Sophie with raised eyebrows, clearly having forgotten. Her name already. Miller, Sophie supplied. I didn't finish college, actually. The shock on their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. Oh, said Mrs. Holland, as if Sophie had admitted to a criminal record. How ... unusual. Mr. Clarkson cleared his throat. Self-taught, then? There's something to be said for determination. His condescension was so thick Sophie could almost touch it. As dinner progressed, Sophie became increasingly invisible to her table mates. They discussed vacation homes in the Hamptons, private school admissions, and yacht clubs conversations deliberately designed to exclude outsiders. Midway through the main course, a commotion near the front caught everyone's attention. A photographer was taking pictures of the VIP tables, with guests posing elegantly beside the event's major donors. Who invited her? The question, just loud enough to be heard, came from a woman at the next table who was staring directly at Sophie. The woman's companions turned to look, not bothering to hide their amusement at Sophie's plain dress and simple hairstyle. A ripple of laughter spread, and Sophie found herself the center of unwanted attention. Eyes turned her way, some curious, others openly derisive. Probably someone's housekeeper who got confused about the date. A man in an expensive suit stage whispered, generating more laughter. Sophie sat perfectly still, her face expressionless, though her chest tightened painfully. The moment stretched. On a frozen tableau of her at the center of cruel amusement, Mason, noticing the commotion from across the room, started making his way toward her table, concern etched on his face. But before he could reach her, the evening's Menci tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. It's time to begin our pledge drive for the new Children's Cancer Research Wing. The laughter subsided, though. Sophie could still feel eyes on her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here. It wasn't about these people or their opinions. It was about the children fighting cancer, about families like hers had been taught with renewed resolve. She straightened her shoulders and focused on the stage, ignoring the whispers that continued around her as the pledge drive began. A sleek promotional video played on large screens throughout the ballroom. Images of children battling cancer filled the room, their brave smiles, their hopeful eyes, their parents' love and determination. The video ended with an architectural rendering of the proposed research wing, a state-of-the-art facility that would help develop new treatments. Our goal tonight, announced the MC, is to raise $5 million toward the $10 million needed to break ground. Who will start us off? Hands began to rise with donations ranging from 5 to 6 figures. Each pledge was met with applause, the larger ones earning standing ovations. At table 16, the Hollands pledged $50,000 to appreciative murmurs. The Clarksons followed with $75,000, while the Franklins offered $100,000. And you, dear? Mrs. Holland turned to Sophie with a condescending smile. Perhaps you could manage $100? Every little bit helps. Sophie didn't respond to the jab. Instead, she studied the pledge card before her, calculating in her head. The children in the video reminded her so much of Owen, their thinning hair, their too wise eyes, their fragile bodies housing indomitable spirits. Mason appeared at her side, looking apologetic. I'm so sorry about all this, he whispered. I had no idea they would be so. It's fine, Sophie interrupted gently. The cause is what matters. He nodded gratefully. The foundation does amazing work. Every dollar goes directly to research, not administrative costs or fancy parties. He gestured around the ballroom with a wry smile. Who oversees the research program? Sophie asked. Dr. Priya Sharma. She's brilliant. Developed a treatment protocol that's improved survival rates by 30% in some aggressive childhood leukemias. She's here tonight. Mason pointed to a modest woman in a simple black dress, speaking with the meek dot something in Dr. Sharma's focused expression reminded Sophie of herself, the look of someone more concerned with substance than appearance dot as Mason was called away. Again, Sophie noticed Victoria Holland watching her with thinly veiled contempt. It's remarkable, isn't it? Mrs. Holland said loudly to her companions, how some people attend these events without contributing meaningfully, almost as if they're here for the free dinner. The table erupted in muffled laughter, which died abruptly when Sophie finally spoke. I was just thinking the same thing, she said calmly, meeting Mrs. Holland's gaze. About people who seem more interested in being seen than in actually helping children. Mrs. Holland's face flushed crimson. Well, but she was interrupted by the MC's voice booming through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now at $3 million. We're still $2 million short of tonight's goal. Who will help us close the gap? Sophie quietly raised her hand, though no one at her table noticed. Yes, the lady in the cream dress at table 16. The MC called out, pointing directly at Sophie. All eyes turned toward the back of the room. Sophie stood, her posture relaxed but confident. And your pledge amount, ma'am? The MC prompted, pen poised over his notepad. $10 million, Sophie stated clearly. A stunned silence fell over the ballroom. The MC blinked rapidly, as if he'd misheard. I'm sorry, did you say $10 million? Sophie repeated. That should cover the entire research wing, with some left over for operating costs in the first year. Whispers erupted across the room. At table 16, Mrs. Holland's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Mr. Clarkson's jaw literally dropped. The MC fumbled with his notes. That's incredibly generous, Ms. Miller, Sophie Miller. A man near the front suddenly stood up, his face lighting with recognition. Wait, Sophie Miller of Next Health Solutions. The whispers grew louder. Sophie nodded once, maintaining her composure. The Sophie Miller? The man continued, his voice carrying across the now silent room. The founder and CEO who revolutionized cancer treatment protocols with integrated patient data systems. Yes. Mason confirmed proudly, stepping forward. That's exactly who she is. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted dramatically. Faces that had been dismissive or mocking moments ago now showed shock, embarrassment, and in some cases, a hasty recalibration to respect Dr. Sharma pushed through the crowd, approaching Sophie with genuine emotion in her eyes. Miss Miller? Your software has saved countless lives by identifying treatment patterns we never would have seen otherwise. And now this donation, she seemed at a loss for words. Victoria Holland stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. Sophie, I had no idea. We had no idea. Clearly, Sophie replied, simply. Mr. Clarkson attempted damage control. If we had known who you were, then you would have treated me differently, Sophie finished for him. That's precisely the problem, isn't it? The Franklins looked at their plates, too mortified to speak. Around them, the room buzzed with activity as people tried to position themselves closer to Sophie, suddenly eager to be associated with the unassuming billionaire in their midst. Mason beamed at his former boss, not surprised in the least by her generosity. He'd known who she was all along, of course, but had respected her wish for anonymity. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC announced, his voice cracking with emotion. Thanks to the extraordinary generosity of Miss Sophie Miller, founder of Next Health Solutions, we have not only met our goal for the evening, but exceeded it. The Reed Children's Cancer Research Wing will become a reality. The ballroom erupted in applause, though many of the clapping hands belonged to people who had been laughing at Sophie only minutes before dot. As the initial shock wore off, the ballroom became a flurry of activity. The event photographer who had pointedly ignored Sophie earlier now hovered nearby, angling for a shot. Guests who had whispered behind their hands now approached with business cards and effusive compliments. Through it all, Sophie maintained her quiet dignity. She spoke at length with Dr. Sharma about the research wing's priorities, genuinely engaged in the conversation while politely but firmly deflecting social climbers. Victoria Holland made 3 separate attempts to reintroduce herself. Each one met with Sophie's courteous but distant acknowledgement. I hope there are no hard feelings, Mrs. Holland eventually said, her voice honeyed with false warmth. If I'd only known who you were, that's exactly the point, isn't it? Sophie interrupted. Gently. We shouldn't need to know someone's net worth to treat them with basic courtesy. Mrs. Holland flushed, opening her mouth to respond but finding no words. Near the end of the evening, Sophie found herself momentarily alone with Mason. You could have told them who I was, she said. Save me from being the evening's entertainment. Mason shook his head. Would you have wanted that? To be treated differently because of your money rather than who you are. Sophie smiled. Genuinely this time, as she prepared to leave, the MC asked if she would like to address the crowd. Sophie hesitated, then stepped up to the microphone. My brother Owen died of leukemia when he was 12, she said simply. Tonight isn't about me or my donation. It's about making sure other families don't experience what mine did. Judge people by their character, not their clothes or their bank accounts. Sometimes the person you least expect is the one with the most to offer. With those words, she handed Dr. Sharma the check, nodded once to the silent crowd, and walked out of the ballroom, leaving Boston's elite to reflect on the woman they had so quickly. Dismissed. Some battles are won not with loud confrontation, but with quiet dignity. Sophie Miller taught Boston's elite a powerful lesson about judging others by appearance. Reminder that true worth isn't measured by clothes or jewelry, but by character and actions.